VCY America presents Crosstalk, a nationwide call-in program discussing issues that have an effect on our families, our communities, our churches, our nation, and our world. Crosstalk, an opportunity for you to voice your concerns for biblical principles. And now live by satellite and around the world on the internet at vcyamerica.org. Here is today's Crosstalk.
And welcome to Crosstalk here on VCY America. Jim Schneider with you today. And the other day as we were talking on Crosstalk, we had this open forum, many of you commenting on about what's going on in the state of Alabama right now. And several of you from within Alabama just asking for people around the nation to be praying for you. And certainly the tyranny from the judicial branch of government that we are seeing take place in Alabama is something that's been experienced in other states as well. But the difference in Alabama right now is that we have people within the state who are standing up to a judge's ruling and saying, no, that is not the law here in the state of Alabama. And so therefore, we're not going to circumvent the will of the voters who passed a constitutional amendment here in our state. So what are the ramifications of all of this? How does a rule of law apply to this when you have conflict between the state and the federal judiciary? It's our privilege to have with us today Mat Staver. He is the founder, president, and general counsel of Liberty Counsel, an international nonprofit litigation, education, and policy organization dedicated to advancing religious freedom, the sanctity of life, and the family. He is dean of the Liberty School of Law. And, Matt, we appreciate you taking some time out to join us today here on Crosstalk.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be with you.
Well, as you know, and many listeners know, the major fight is going on right now, a fight for marriage, a fight for who has constitutional authority. It's underway right now in the state of Alabama. Your organization, Liberty Counsel, is very much engaged in this matter, but I think it would be important for us to begin by setting the foundation so we can look back to see what has brought us to this point. And let's begin, Matt, going back maybe to the year 2006, because we understand, isn't that when the voters in Alabama, by 81%, passed a constitutional amendment defining marriage as the union of one man and one woman?
Yeah, that's right. It's actually, as I believe, the count was 82%.
82.
In 2006, it was an overwhelming majority of the people that affirmed the natural definition of marriage as the union of a man and a woman. And that didn't create marriage. It just affirmed the definition of it, put it in the state constitution. It was already in the state laws, and obviously it's been practiced for millennia of generations because it's common sense as it's part of the natural created order of male and female. Then last month, a federal district judge down in southern Alabama issued a single ruling saying that the marriage laws were struck down, and then some of the probate judges were being forced or told by the ACLU and others that they needed to issue these marriage licenses around the state. The stay on her decision was lifted on February the 9th, just a few days ago, Monday of this week. And the Supreme Court of the United States refused to extend that stay while it's in the litigation. So, on Monday of this week, some people got same-sex marriage licenses. However, Sunday night of this same week, the Chief Justice, Roy Moore, of the Alabama Supreme Court issued an administrative order to all the probate judges saying that they had no authority and they were prohibited from issuing same-sex marriage licenses because it is not the law of the state. The law of the state is very clear, and that is marriage licenses can only be issued to a man and a woman, not to two people of the same sex. So most of the probate judges are following that administrative order. There's been a few, however, that have not followed it. Some have felt intimidated, and even today, by the way, there have been some that have stopped. There was one, for example, that said he would issue licenses, but he had not yet. And after he read our petition before the Supreme Court of Alabama, which we filed yesterday, he then came out publicly and said, based upon that information in our petition that we filed yesterday afternoon, he would not issue licenses to same-sex couples. So the battle is going on. We've got a case now currently pending before the Alabama Supreme Court, asking the entire court now to weigh in on this and to order the probate judges, the few that have issued same-sex marriage licenses, to cease and desist, to stop. So right now we've got a real battle going on between the federal court and the state court. And in my view, the state court is in the right for several reasons, which we can talk about.
Matt, now the U.S. Supreme Court refused to keep that stay in motion there, and I know that a couple of the justices, Scalia and Thomas, had a lot to say about that. What was their response to the U.S. Supreme Court not continuing that stay?
They were outraged by that, and this Supreme Court, the majority of them, have been really despicable in how they've dealt with this issue. They have not had anything consistent. They have put stays on cases, and then they decided not to review them, and then they put stays on cases, and then they've lifted the stay, and then they haven't put stays on cases that have requested stays. So they have been completely inconsistent. Two of the justices, Kagan and Ginsburg, ought to recuse themselves from any such decision. They have injected themselves personally and publicly into this issue. Last fall, when some cases were pending before the court, it wasn't just pending in the country, but it was pending at the United States Supreme Court. These two justices actually engaged in public same-sex ceremonies in which they presided over those ceremonies. So they've injected themselves into the issue. It's clear that they ought to recuse themselves. The problem is that there's no higher authority that can force them to recuse when they refuse to recuse.
Let's kind of review back here. Justice Roy Moore issued this memorandum, and a quote from one of your news releases on this. He said, effective immediately, no probate judge of the state of Alabama, nor any agent or employee of any Alabama probate judge shall issue or recognize a marriage license that is inconsistent with the Alabama Constitution. Matt, does Justice Roy Moore have the authority to say that?
Yes, he does, for several reasons. First of all, it is the state court that has authority over the probate judges, not the federal courts. Secondly, any federal court ruling, whether from this single judge in the southern part of Alabama or any place else, does not have binding authority over any state court. Any federal decision is merely an advisory decision or opinion and does not have any binding effect on any state court anywhere, including, and most importantly, the Alabama Supreme Court. And finally, and other reasons why, this judge is in the Southern District. So even if she had an order that applied in the southern part of Alabama, it wouldn't apply in what's called the Middle District or the Northern District. That's not her jurisdiction. And finally, she only had a certain identifiable people in front of her, and she had no probate judges. So even in the case where you would argue that it's applicable across the state, it doesn't apply to the probate judges, and those are the ones that issue licenses for marriage. So for a number of reasons, all of the authority is on the side of Chief Justice Roy Moore. The probate judges are under the state jurisdiction, under the Chief Justice of the Alabama Supreme Court. Federal courts are not binding. This particular federal decision does not have jurisdiction over the whole state and certainly has no jurisdiction over any of the probate judges. So they must follow the law. That law is very clear. It's not ambiguous. That law is still in effect, and that law is marriage is only the union of a man and a woman.
Man, we have seen, though, state after state after state crumble because of it appears to be the same scenario that's unfolded here with the state of Alabama. Why, or is Alabama different than the other states, or have all other states just capitulated to these federal rulings and the lifted stays and so forth?
They capitulated. Alabama has a Chief Justice and others on the Alabama Supreme Court that are more serious about the original understanding of the Constitution and the rule of law. And they're right. You know, even in California, where you had this same situation play out over there, you had the same thing. You had a single federal judge with certain individuals in front of that court. It didn't apply to other districts of California. And yet what you had is a liberal governor and attorney general that tried to intimidate all of the clerks there to issue licenses to same-sex couples. They didn't need to. This never had to happen in Massachusetts either. When Governor Mitt Romney was governor, he didn't need to enforce that court order. It didn't need to happen in Wisconsin. Scott Walker was wrong when he said, well, the courts have spoken, we just have to follow suit. No, that's not true. He had a lot of opportunity to uphold the rule of law, but he caved in. I think what we have are some people that are politicians or even judges who are weak-kneed, and they've never really looked at the rule of law from a serious constitutional perspective.
Let's look at this issue, because we keep hearing that, this boils down to the rule of law. But I think it's important that we understand what branch of government establishes law.
Well, and let's look at the rule of law. Just because a judge issues an order does not make that the rule of law. Now, somebody might say, "Oh, that's absurd." Well, then was Dred Scott the rule of law when you had a majority of the Supreme Court say that blacks were not entitled to full citizenship because they are, quote, inferior human beings? Was that really the rule of law? Well, that resulted in a civil war. No one will uphold that decision now. It was no more valid then than it is now. Was Buck versus Bell the rule of law, where Oliver Wendell Holmes said that Virginia can forcibly sterilize Carrie Buck because, quote, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough because your family has a low IQ, then Virginia can choose not to allow you to procreate so that you won't have more children with low IQ. Is that really the rule of law? That became a model piece of legislation when it was upheld by the Supreme Court, used by Adolf Hitler as part of his eugenics movement. And then the Nazis cited that Supreme Court decision in the Nuremberg trials in defense of the Nazi eugenics program. Just because a judge issues a decision does not make it the rule of law. Was Korematsu the rule of law, where it says you can put Asians in internment camps simply because they're Asians, and you can take away their due process of law just because they're Asians? No, that was a bigoted, wrong Supreme Court decision. Supreme Court's made a lot of mistakes. Judges make a lot of mistakes. What the rule of law is very simple. Number one, we've got a higher law that we have, and our earthly laws need to conform to it. But number two, we've got a Constitution. And that Constitution is not some malleable document that can be invented from day to day as a new idea in some judge's head. It is a specific written document, and they must follow it. And if it doesn't grant a right, they can't then invent it. And if it doesn't give a remedy, they can't give the remedy. They have to abide by that constitutional principle. If they don't like it, then the people can make a new law, but judges have no authority just to write a particular opinion and assume that that's going to be the law. That's not the rule of law. Martin Luther King Jr., when he was in the Birmingham jail, he says there's 2 laws. There's just laws and unjust laws. A just law conforms to higher law. You must obey it. An unjust law is contrary to higher law. And he agreed with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. I mean, when we talk about the rule of law, let's stop fooling ourselves that just because a judge puts a pen to the paper or types out something on a computer, that all of a sudden becomes the rule of law. There's a lot of things that we would not support now that judges have done that are clearly wrong, clearly bigoted, and clearly unconstitutional.
Mat Staver is our guest here today as we're talking about marriage under attack. An Alabama Supreme Court justice is standing up. We'll be back with our discussion, and be ready also to jot down some phone numbers. I'm going to provide you some points of contact to let your voice be heard in the state of Alabama. You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America.
Back to Genesis with Dr. John Morris, scientist and creation researcher with the Institute for Creation Research. Dr. Morris, where do fingerprints come from?
Chris, fingerprints are unique for each individual, produced by nuances in the genetic code. Now, koala bears also have fingerprints which look surprisingly like human fingerprints, even though in evolution we're not closely related to the koala bears. These are much more human-like than are those pseudo-fingerprints of chimpanzees, which evolutionists think are our closest relative. And how can that be? Evolutionists conclude koala bears and humans evolved their fingerprints independently, a convenient non-answer to evidence which fits creation and not evolution. Chris, the evidence doesn't fit evolution because evolution isn't true. We were created in God's image, separate from the animals, just like it says back in Genesis.
Thanks, Dr. Morris. For more on creation, visit our website at www.icr.org.
Whereas there's been capitulation in state after state after state, Alabama says, no way, not here, at least a Supreme Court justice in Alabama. I have a statement. Well, I've got several things here. First of all, Matt, we are seeing how the media is spinning this, and you were just talking about rule of law. So various media have been reporting that Chief Justice Roy Moore is defying a gay marriage law. You are saying that is totally false. There is no gay marriage law, correct?
Yeah, and you don't even have to get to the discussion that we just had. The fact of the matter is, it's very clear. The federal judge, even on Monday, refused to hold a probate judge in contempt of court when requested to do so by the ACLU. Mm-hmm. Why? Because the judge said she did not have any jurisdiction over the probate judge. So it's even clear in her mind that her order does not go to these probate judges. Chief Justice Roy Moore is correct. The liberal media just wants to ignore the truth and spin something against Chief Justice Roy Moore. But he's absolutely correct. He's within the law. It is the law that he has clearly articulated in Alabama.
Here's another case of media spin on this issue, and this is from our hometown paper yesterday, our Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. They ran this AP story about this new book coming out, that's come out by David Axelrod, served as a top advisor in the White House, who indicated how Mr. Obama misled the people on his real position on same-sex marriage as he ran for president. That's another whole issue there. But here's how the article closed. Alabama Chief Justice Roy Moore threw the state into disarray when at the 11th hour he ordered probate judges not to allow gay marriages. He gave the order even though a federal judge ruled the state's ban was unconstitutional, and the U.S. Supreme Court allowed the marriages to begin Monday. Matt, it wasn't Judge Roy Moore that threw the state into disarray.
No, it wasn't Roy Moore who threw the state into disarray. It was the ACLU and Lambda Legal Defense and the media. And it was the judge who originally issued a decision that essentially said or made people think that everyone had to comply. But when actually confronted with the issue in terms of the enforcement of her order, she had to back down, and she did that Monday afternoon. Did the media pick up on that? No. They simply ignored it. If this judge then, when confronted with the very issue, decided that she did not have jurisdiction, then why did the media ignore that? Why did they not say, well, it looks like the executive or the administrative order from Alabama Chief Justice Roy Moore on Sunday night was correct, because on Monday late afternoon, the federal judge agreed she did not have authority and jurisdiction over these probate judges.
You have offered to defend the probate judges at Liberty Counsel, correct?
Yes, we've done two things. Number one, we've offered to defend the probate judges if they get sued by any organization such as the ACLU. On the other hand, yesterday afternoon, we filed what's called a mandamus before the Alabama Supreme Court, asking the entire court to tell those few probate judges that did issue same-sex marriage licenses to cease and desist. And as I mentioned, there was a judge that we just got word this morning, a probate judge, who had publicly said that he would issue such licenses, but after he read our filing done yesterday afternoon before the Alabama Supreme Court, realized that we are in fact correct, and he has no authority, and he publicly said he will not issue same-sex marriage licenses.
Well, folks, if you'd like to contact the Alabama Supreme Court to stand with Justice Roy Moore in this, you can contact them, and I have a phone number which you can do so, 334-229-0700. That's 334-229-0700. Justice Roy Moore has already issued this letter here to probate judges. Why is it important for the full Supreme Court to do that, Matt?
Well, I think it's important for the full Supreme Court to do it, to have a binding order from the entire panel. Chief Justice Roy Moore's administrative order is authoritative, but you've had a few judges that they've violated that administrative order. Not many, but a few. Now, some of them have done that because they were intimidated by the federal court. Some of them have said they would issue licenses. They've backed away. The majority are not. We want an order from the entire court, and that will be a clear message to these probate judges. They must cease and desist from issuing licenses to same-sex marriage couples.
This coming April, the U.S. Supreme Court is supposed to be hearing a case on marriage and taking up the states, including Alabama. A decision expected to come out by the end of June. So by allowing all of these so-called same-sex marriages to go forth, is the Supreme Court, in essence, revealing their hand to us, how they're going to rule on the issue? I mean, it's like the whole country is being thrown into chaos because of their not putting these stays into place or upholding stays.
The Supreme Court is absolutely duplicitous. You can't trust them anymore on this issue or many other issues, frankly. And their actions are undermining the confidence in the people that they're acting consistent with the Constitution, which they're clearly not. They're making up things as they go. In 2013, they said that in the Windsor case that marriage is the clear authority under the states, that they have the authority to have marriage as the definition of their choice. Now, if that's what they really meant with a 5-4 decision, then they should have ultimately rule that these marriage laws are constitutional. That there is no constitutional provision that says you can't define marriage as the union of a man and a woman. So we just don't know what they're going to do because they've been so inconsistent. They've stayed cases, they've not stayed cases. They stayed cases, they've reversed the stay. It's completely unpredictable what this court's going to do. And the reason why, it would be very easy to predict what they're going to do if they follow the rule of law. It'd be pretty simple. But they're making it up as they go, and they're making a mess of this country. I think what's going to be on trial more than marriage is not going to be on trial. Marriage is the union of a man and a woman. What's going to be on trial is the legitimacy, or the opposite, the illegitimacy of this Supreme Court. We can't keep trusting this court if they just make up things willy-nilly by virtue of a majority vote. If they're not going to follow the Constitution that they have sworn an oath to uphold, then that undermines the legitimacy of this particular institution.
Matt, if this Supreme Court defies God, they defy the very definition of marriage, if they defy states' constitutions and the amendments that the people passed in their states, can there be any state who stands up to that and say, we will not accept that decision?
Yeah, I think there can be. I think there should have been when Dred Scott happened. Mm-hmm. Rather than throw the entire country into a civil war, the state should have simply said, that's nuts. You mean blacks are not full citizens because you say that they are inferior human beings? Really? Well, where do you get that in the Constitution? Where do you get that in the history of the law? Where do you get that in revealed law or natural law? That's a contrary, bigoted opinion by a racist judge whose name was Taney. He had conflicts with Abraham Lincoln. And instead of the court ultimately doing the right thing, we later were engulfed in a civil war. You know, the fact of the matter is, no one today would support that decision. It wasn't the rule of law then. It was a racist, bigoted decision. It was an opinion that just simply garnered enough people to get 5 or more votes. It doesn't make it consistent with the Constitution or constitutional. Just because they come up with some cockeyed ruling doesn't mean that the rest of the country has to follow it. In fact, in 1992, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, she used as a justification, wrongly so, for upholding Roe versus Wade, she said, even if it was wrongly decided, we've got to uphold it. Why? She said, because the only authority we have as a court is the confidence of the people. We can't make laws like the legislature. We can't enforce laws like the executive. We're an institution that has to rely upon the confidence of the people. The people have confidence that we're following the Constitution and at least reason. If they lose that confidence, she said, well, then guess what? We lose our authority. We have no way to make law. We have no way to enforce law. We have to rely upon the executive to enforce it. The only authority we have is if they trust that we're doing the right thing and using the Constitution and reason to do it. If they lose that, we lose our authority. And that's why she said we needed to uphold Roe versus Wade, because if we ultimately reversed course, people would say, well, wait a minute. You're now saying it's not in the Constitution, whereas you said it was in the Constitution? What's the real truth here? Are you guys just making things up as you go? How can we trust you? That's where we are with this situation of the court. This court is just completely inconsistent. The people can only take so much of this. And once the people lose confidence that those 9 people or 5 people that constitute a majority, once they lose confidence in that institution, they lose confidence in the system, and that institution loses its authority.
Matt, I'd like to read to you a quote because there's another branch of government here that we need to talk about, and that is the executive branch, namely that of the governor, Robert Bentley, for Alabama. And this Monday, he issued a statement on the matter. He said the issue of same-sex marriage will finally be decided by the U.S. Supreme Court later this year. I have great respect for the legal process and the protections that the law provides for our people. I am disappointed that a single federal court judge disregarded the vote of the Alabama people to define marriage as between a man and a woman. I agree with the dissenting opinion from U.S. Supreme Court Justices Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia when they stated that today's decision represents yet another example of this court's cavalier attitude toward the states. Over the past few months, the court has repeatedly denied stays of lower court judgments, enjoining the enforcement of state laws on questionable constitutional grounds. This issue has created confusion with conflicting direction for probate judges in Alabama. Probate judges have a unique responsibility in our state, and I support them. I will not take any action against probate judges, which would only serve to further complicate this issue. We will follow the rule of law in Alabama and allow the issue of same-sex marriage to be worked out through the proper legal channels. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think he's correct. I think he is correct that the Supreme Court has caused confusion, and they've caused harm, and they've caused a weakening of their own institution. I mean, how can we respect a court that goes all different directions, and there's no principled way to determine which way they're going to go? They have no way to justify their decisions. They cannot justify what they are doing. They are acting contrary to the rule of law. So how can you respect it? That's number one. Number two, even if the Supreme Court were to say, wrongly so, that there's some invented right to same-sex marriage, and therefore you can't have marriage as a union of man and woman, Alabama, in my view, does not have to obey that. I think that is so far off the beaten path, so far removed from the Constitution, that it is no rule of law. There is a limit to what the court can do. There's a limit to what the people can stomach. If that court were to say the laws of gravity were fine for the founders, but we have progressed, we're a progressive society, and we don't want to, we think that they have changed, you would say, that's nuts. Have they lost their mind? Well, the question is, have they lost their mind by saying that there's a constitutional right for same-sex marriage, that there's no difference between marriage between a man and a woman and two people of the same sex? Have they literally lost their mind? They cannot point to any place of the Constitution that supports that decision or anything remotely resembling such a decision.
Folks, we're going to take a quick break, and before we open our phone lines, I have a couple of clips from President Obama, who has weighed in on this issue, and I want to share those with you. We'll get Matt's comments, and then we'll get phone lines here in just a few moments. But marriage is under attack. I guess I should broaden that to say our Constitution is under attack and states' authority under attack. But we have an Alabama Supreme Court justice who is standing up and saying, I object. This is the law in our state. We'll be right back. You're listening to Crosstalk.
Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis writes that if you look around in your church today, 2/3 of the young people who are sitting among us have already left in their hearts. Soon they'll be gone for good. Even some Bible colleges, seminaries, and Christian schools do not accept the first 11 chapters of Genesis as literal history. In response, Crosstalk is making available the Ken Ham Classics Set, a library of 6 books designed to provide a sure foundation on biblical teaching. In this set are the books 6 Days, The Age of the Earth and the Decline of the Church, Already Gone, How Could a Loving God, One Race, One Blood, Raising Godly Children in an Ungodly World, and The Lie, Evolution. Through February 28th, Crosstalk is making available this set of books for a donation of just $43. Ask for the set of Ken Ham Classics when you call 1-800-729-9829, 1-800-729-9829, or order through February 28th online at vcyamerica.org.
You're listening to Crosstalk on VCY America, and Liberty Counsel, by the way, folks, has petitioned the entire Alabama Supreme Court to stand behind Justice Moore. This is not Matt saying it. This is me saying this. If you want to weigh in on this issue, if you want to contact the Alabama Supreme Court to uphold the decision from Justice Roy Moore, to support him in that decision, and for them to rule as a body on this issue, you can contact the court at 334-229-0700. President Obama is weighing in on this. He had an interview with BuzzFeed, and I have a couple clips. He first talked about a number of states now recognizing same-sex marriage and saying that, it's time to end this patchwork of marriage laws. Here's what he had to say.
My sense is that the Supreme Court is about to make a shift, one that I welcome, which is to recognize that having hit a critical mass of states that have recognized same-sex marriage, that it doesn't make sense for us to now have this patchwork system, and that it's time to recognize that under the Equal Protection Clause of the United States, same-sex couples should have the same rights as anybody else.
Okay, Matt, he talks about this critical mass of states that recognize same-sex marriage. It doesn't seem to me like the states have. We've got perhaps one judge in one location administering his interpretation on the people and on the states.
Yeah, we haven't reached anywhere near a critical mass of states. We've reached a number of states where there's been a single judge or an appellate court that have issued a ruling, but certainly not a critical mass of states. The people are still on the other side of this issue. The constitutional amendments were soundly passed by the people in state after state after state after state. So there is no critical mass that's shifted. The only critical mass that shifted, it's in the president's head on this issue. He's the one who shifted. But certainly, the laws of morality and the natural created order of male and female, they don't shift. And just because you have, even if you did have a shifting population vote, which we don't have, you could no more say on this issue that you reach critical mass or a consensus, and therefore you ought to go this way, any more than you would on slavery. Just because there's a critical mass, allegedly, or a consensus on slavery doesn't mean that slavery is right. And it doesn't mean that slavery can be done in one state and not in the other. Morality and this natural created dignity of the human being in God's image, it doesn't have geographical boundaries. Marriage is universal. It predated religion. It's not created by Catholics or Protestants or any religion. It predates religion. It predates any government institution. It is part of the natural created order. If you can't get marriage, if you can't get the complementary nature of the sexes and why it's important, then you can't get much of anything. It's part of the natural, created, observable order. It is the union of a man and a woman.
Here is, the president was also asked on BuzzFeed as to his reaction here to Judge Roy Moore. Here is the response.
But there's a core principle here that's at stake, which is we have a supremacy clause in our Constitution. When federal law is in conflict with state law, federal law wins out. And my understanding is that my recollection is Judge Moore had a similar problem with a federal court ruling that you couldn't put a huge Ten Commandments statue in the middle of your courthouse. And ultimately, federal law was obeyed, and I think that the same thing will end up happening here.
Was there anything you'd say to him?
I think that the courts at the federal level will have something to say to him.
Matt, he says, our Constitution has this supremacy clause. Comment on that matter.
Well, there is a supremacy clause, but you don't even get to the supremacy clause issue here. I mean, it's very simple. The issue really in Alabama is a very simple decision. Does this federal judge have jurisdiction over the probate judges? Answer, no. Why? Because they're not defendants. Secondly, does she have jurisdiction over the whole state? No, because she's only part of 1/3 of the state, the Southern District of Alabama, not the middle or northern. if she had jurisdiction over these probate judges, then she would have held a probate judge in contempt of court on Monday when the ACLU asked her to order a probate judge to act. What did she do? She didn't say, well, the supremacy clause says that I've got authority, and Chief Justice Roy Moore, he's just acting like a renegade. No, she said, I can't do it. I don't have the authority over them. Who does? Well, it's pretty clear in Alabama that it's the Alabama Supreme Court and it's the Chief Justice who issued the administrative order.
Mat Staver is our guest here today on Crosstalk, and folks, we are opening our phone lines if you'd like to ask a question as it relates to this matter of marriage. Alabama, the rule of law. Pick up your phone and call us 800-733-9829, 800-733-9829. One more time, that's 800-733-9829. Matt, if you would respond to this, so often people say, well, what harm is there if two people who love each other want to get married? This isn't stopping men who want to marry women from getting married. What harm is there? What harm is there to traditional marriage? What harm is there to society?
Well, there's several harms, and obviously the first harm that you have, and it's not in any sequence, you got a direct clash with religious liberty. When it came into Massachusetts in 2004, Catholic Charities had to stop doing adoptions. In New Mexico, the photographer had to stop doing weddings. In Oregon, the baker has to stop doing wedding cakes. In New York, a farmer is fined $10,000, $12,000 for refusing to have a same-sex wedding. In New Jersey, a church association lost its property tax exemption for refusing to allow its facilities to be used by a same-sex couple for a civil union. So this is where it has a direct clash on religious liberty. It's a very intolerant agenda because you're actually putting sexual immorality at the same level as race. And what you can't do legally or should not do morally with respect to race will be the same thing with regards to this issue. And it'll affect churches and universities. It'll affect accrediting bodies and everything from student loans to whatever. It is a widespread clash of religious freedom of unprecedented proportions. Secondly, it ultimately undermines the institution of marriage. That's what happened in the Netherlands when same-sex unions came into being there in the 1980s. What did it do? Strengthen marriage? No, it weakened marriage. And when you weaken marriage and people ultimately no longer respect the institution, when you begin to have polygamy, which is what this will do, you cannot stop polygamy if you say same-sex marriage is okay. You just simply can't. You weaken the institution of marriage. You ultimately hurt the family. And when you destabilize the family and you have family units not staying together, you bring in poverty, you bring in lower economics, you ultimately destabilize the community. Thirdly, it's bad for children. As a policy matter, the state is saying, I want all of our people to aspire to these unions. And one of them is a same-sex union. We're going to protect it, give all the laws of protection. Why? Because it's so wonderful. Well, what does that union say? Boys and girls, your moms and dads are absolutely meaningless. Mom and dad have absolutely no meaning or benefit to the well-being of your young men or young girls. And that's simply wrong. That's harmful. We know that is harmful, that children do best when they're raised with a mom and a dad. And finally, why would we take a relationship of same-sex unions, same-sex sexual activity, protect it and elevate it when we know that it's a very harmful and it's a very deadly and damaging relationship? And I didn't have to point to any conservative organization for that. You can go to the Center for Disease Control. Go do a Google search or an Internet search for the Center for Disease Control. It's an independent government agency, and it tracks the problems that you have with men who have sex with men. In every conceivable category, it is dangerous, it's harmful, it's unhealthy, and it's deadly. It's going to have a consequence on our health and well-being. So why would we elevate some kind of bad relationship, bad activity, dangerous and harmful, unhealthy activity to a protected status? We just simply wouldn't do it.
Mat Staver with us today. Lines are packed. We're going to begin in Charleston, Illinois. Jim, you're on the air.
Yes, I had a couple of questions. First of all, is there any chance that the two justices that have already performed gay marriage ceremonies will recuse themselves? Because I'm reminded that Elena Kagan did not recuse herself during the Obamacare-related decisions, even though her job prior to being appointed to the Supreme Court was to help propagate that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we need to put I think the public needs to just express absolute outrage over that. And as we get closer to to the April, I think we ought to have a big public outcry, because it's pretty clear from the federal law that when they have a conflict like this, they need to recuse themselves. And it's good for the court to do so, because it makes the people have confidence. Someone's not going to act with a self-interest, a predetermined result. Well, if they're being asked to rule on same-sex marriage, and yet they participated in same-sex marriages, when the case of same-sex marriage was pending before them, how can you trust them? Mm-hmm. It undermines the confidence of the court. Now, if they don't, the problem is there an enforcement mechanism? And right now, there's not really an enforcement mechanism other than impeachment. But, impeachment is something that is there in the Constitution for the members of Congress to use when necessary.
Yeah. Thank you for the call here. And speaking of Congress, Matt, House Speaker John Boehner said while this is going on, the House is not going to weigh in on either side of this constitutional issue. He said that we're not going to weigh in it as a body, but we know the executive branch is doing everything possible to destroy true marriage, but we have the legislative body saying, well, we're just going to stay silent on the issue.
Well, Boehner's a wimp. He has no leadership at all in Congress, and he really, frankly, shouldn't be the Speaker of the House in these critical times. I have no real confidence in John Boehner's leadership in the House of Representatives. He needs to weigh in. If this was Obama as the Speaker of the House, you better believe he would weigh in. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But this Speaker is basically weak-kneed and he needs to get a spine.
Mark and Monroe, you're on the air.
It seems to me that the Fed's gimmick to trump the rule of law is to legalize lawlessness. In other words, anytime they come up against a wall of what law is, their tendency and tactic is to either redefine it or whatever and declare it as being legal, and then turn it around and say, well, as long as it's legal,
Hello?
We have to enforce it.
Mm-hmm.
That's my comment.
Yep, Matt. Hello, Matt. Okay, I thank you for your comment here. I'm guessing Mat Staver has lost audio connection here with us. Are you there, Matt? Hello, Matt. Okay. Tell you what, we're going to reestablish communication with Mat Staver there at Liberty Counsel. Something happened evidently with the phone line here, so we'll reconnect with Matt. We're just seconds away from a break. By the way, again, the phone number here to the Alabama Supreme Court is 334-229-0700. And certainly there is a petition before them right now to stand with Chief Justice Roy Moore as it relates to upholding the Constitution of the state of Alabama. Seems like it should be a no-brainer, but yet the other justices not weighing in as of yet. You can contact them at 334-229-0700. We'll take a quick break and be back in 1 minute. You're listening to Crosstalk.
For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House. Our website's worldviewweekend.com. We're looking at 8 transformational steps to a global false church. Number 1 was redefining Jesus. Number 2, redefining the gospel. Number 3, redefining the definition of a Christian. Boy, doesn't that go on today. Well, what does it mean to be a Christian? Oh, you just love Jesus? But we have to go back to the first 2. What do you mean by Jesus, and what is the gospel? If you have Jesus and the gospel wrong, guess what? You're not a Christian. Many today in our churches are false converts because we've led them to believe they're a good person that just needs a little bit of Jesus, just a little bit of the cross. We've talked a lot about God's grace and mercy, which is certainly true, amen, but we haven't talked a lot about God's great wrath, and without His great wrath, there is no contextual meaning for His mercy and grace. And so we've led many to become followers of an easy believism that has created a false Christian. For the Worldview Weekend Minute, I'm Brandon House.
This is Crosstalk on VCY America. Mat Staver with us from Liberty Counsel. Matt, we got you back here?
Yes, I'm back. Sorry,
Okay.
we got disconnected.
Okay, we could hear you, but you couldn't hear us for some reason. We're going next to Douglas in Wisconsin Rapids. You're on the air, Douglas.
Yes, hi. Listen, we in Wisconsin voted, we had a majority vote for man and woman marriage.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we put in.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we supported, our base, which you might call it the grassroots, supported for the re-election of Mr. Walker as governor. Okay? When he came over here to Wisconsin Rapids, he said a lot of things in support of marriage. So, okay, now he's been elected. And so now all of this issue is coming down because here in Wisconsin Rapids, they started to issue out marriage licenses to same-sex couples.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we took issue with that. And now the governor sort of like double-crossed us and said, well, it's the Supreme Court already ruled on it, so we're going to go along with that. Well, they didn't rule on it, not according to what you're saying in this program today. So what could we do now to turn this around?
Matt?
Well, and I also know that I have word that Governor Walker's campaign, if he runs for president, will not address the social issues. So I think he's going to try to run from this issue. I don't think he can run from this issue. It's the biggest social issue of our time, and it needs to be addressed. The fact of the matter is, Governor Walker did not need. He said, "Well, the courts have spoken. We just need to comply." Well, that's not true. He's got his own executive authority. If you go back to Thomas Jefferson, we had the Libel and Sedition Act of 1789, and it was promoted during John Adams, the second president. Well, Thomas Jefferson felt that it was not constitutional, so he refused to enforce it. Abigail Adams was upset, so he wrote a letter to Abigail. And he said, what gave you the idea that judges are the sole arbiters of what's constitutional? He says, if that were the case, it would make the Supreme Court a despotic branch. And history has now agreed with Jefferson. The Libel and Sedition Act of 1789 was wrong. And Lincoln disagreed with the Supreme Court decision on the issue of race. And guess what? History sided with Lincoln and not the Supreme Court. So there's historical precedent for the executive having its own ability to enforce the law. This is what Obama has done. Obama has done it the wrong way, however. Obama looks at laws that should be enforced, and he doesn't enforce them. But they're consistent with the rule of law. He just simply pushes his own liberal ideological agenda. This issue of marriage was not something that was definitively decided upon by the Supreme Court. It's never been decided by the U.S. Supreme Court. So what Walker said is that the courts have spoken, we just need to comply. It's wrong.
Mm-hmm. Isn't that the same thing Mitt Romney did for Massachusetts?
It's exactly the same thing Mitt Romney did for Massachusetts. The 4-3 decision in Massachusetts told the legislature it must act. The legislature never did act. And so what Romney did is went ahead and acted, even when the legislature refused to act. And so he went way beyond where he should have gone, and then he ordered his clerks to issue same-sex marriage licenses. Romney effectively brought same-sex marriage into Massachusetts by his actions.
Let's go to Mike in Bayview. You're on the air, Mike.
Yeah, hi, Jim. Wonderful program today. Say, listen, I just wanted to toss out there that after all of this, who's to say that you can't marry your cat or dog? I mean, this thing's going to snowball and snowball and snowball. And Pastor Matt Truella has a book, The Doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate, that says that they're supposed to, the law of God is supposed to mirror what they're doing, and they're absolutely going against that.
Well, two things. You're right. Once you start to deconstruct marriage and you say that gender's not relevant to it, well, then you can have a man and 2 wives, or a woman and 5 husbands, or 5 men and 5 women. It doesn't matter. Gender's irrelevant. It ultimately takes the gender out of it. So marriage becomes whatever you want it to be. And then also what Matt said is true. It's what Martin Luther King Jr. said in the letter from the Birmingham jail. There's a higher law. It's a law that is higher. It's from God. Earthly laws must conform to it. You should obey those laws. and those are just laws. There's unjust laws. Those are laws created by humans, and they are in conflict with God's higher law, and they're no law at all. And you have a duty to not obey those and put the same authority into those laws.
Yes, that's for sure. And, you know, they used to hang people for treason going against the Constitution and in doing filth like we're doing now. It's sin, and I wonder if they should just start that back up. Maybe everybody might turn away from what they're doing incorrectly.
Certainly, I'm not advocating to hang anybody, but we do need to get back, obviously, to the rule of law. We need to do it in a civil way, and we need to respect the rule of law, because when judges ultimately create things as they go, they ultimately hurt the entire system.
Mike, thanks
and
for
they
the call.
break confidence.
Thanks for the call, Mike. To Pete, you're on the air, Pete.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I appreciate your program, and I love you guys. The whole thing about this, there's really, too much you can do, because I've called Congress, I've called the legislatures. Matter of fact, I left a message over for Walker, telling that I disagree about his decision, what he was saying. But, how much more can a person take, and how much more can we do? It's in God's hands. We all know that. He's got the whole ball of wax.
Well, here's what's going to happen. Obviously, we need to push back. We need to encourage Chief Justice Roy Moore and those that are standing for the rule of law like him. We need to push back against people that are caving in, like Scott Walker and others like him. But on the other hand, every person, every pastor, every church, every religious institution is going to be confronted with this. And institutions are going to be confronted with accreditation, higher education institutions. Churches are going to be confronted with tax exemption, property tax exemption. All of these things are going to come and hit. And the question is, are we just going to sit back and allow that to happen, or are we going to push back? I think that clash is coming. I think it's here. I think it's going to increase. And I think it could be the greatest time for our lives and America and in the history of America. So we're entering into a very challenging time with regards to our religious liberties and our freedom and this issue of marriage. But there are also times in which God can clearly turn things around in a heartbeat.
Pete, we thank you so much for your call, and that also underscores the importance of prayer in all of this. Folks, to weigh in with the Alabama Supreme Court, the number 334-229-0700. Matt, your website there at Liberty Counsel and contact?
LC.org. It's LC.org, and our number is 800-671-1776, or LC.org.
Great. Mat Staver from Liberty Counsel, thanks for being with us.
Thank you. My pleasure.
You've been listening to Crosstalk via satellite and the Internet from VCY America. Views expressed may or may not be those of this station. For a CD of today's program, send a donation of $6 or more to VCY Tape Ministry, 3434 West Kilbourne Avenue, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, 53208. Or download by RSS or podcast from crosstalkamerica.com. And join us again for Crosstalk.